All right, I will say good morning. I have a beautiful, beautiful daf ahead of us today. Today's daf is Chaf Beis. We are picking up Emir Hashem. We are picking up on Chaf Aleph on Beis. I want to begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Ed and Faith Wolf, and family in memory of beloved father, grandfather, and great-grandfather Cyrus Wolf, Shalom ben Tzvi Hirsch, Zichron Livracha. Our week of learning sponsors, Joe and Galia Berry, in honor of their 43rd wedding anniversary and their successful aliyah 3.5 years ago. Our Daf Yomi sponsors, Milton and Melanie Gertner, in memory of Milt's father, Getzel ben Avram, Zichron Livracha, and Alan and Sherry Steinmetz, in memory of Sherry's mother, a survivor of the Holocaust who raised beautiful new generations. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families in nechama. And one additional sponsorship for today, Michael and Rivki Leichter, Mazel Tov to David Leichter on the occasion of his Hanachas Tefillin. May you continue being a source of nachas for your entire family and Klal Yisrael. Beautiful. We'll say with that, let us begin. So let's pick up. We are picking up on Chaf Aleph from base 21b, and we are picking up. Amarav Hamnuna, which is 2, 4, 6, 7 lines up from the bottom, middle of the line. So both sides. So continuing in this magnificently beautiful Gemara. Amarav Hamnuna, Mai dichsev vaydaber shloshes alafim mashal vayishiro chamish ve'alef. So we'll say, what's the meaning of the pasuk? What's the meaning of the pasuk when it says in Malachim that Shlomo HaMelech went ahead and spoke 3,000 mashalim, 3,000 parables, and 1,005 songs? So the Gemara says, "Melamed Shomer Shlomo al kol davar v'davar shel Torah shloshes alafim mashal." Bosai teaches us something amazing, that Shlomo HaMelech said 3,000 parables, 3,000 parables on every kol davar v'davar. Literally means on every single aspect, every single part of Torah. The Gemara says, "Shloshes alafim mashal al kol davar v'davar shel sofrim." 3,000 mashalim on every din d'Rabbanan, chamisha ve'elef tamim, and ultimately again, or shal sofrim chamisha of tamim, and again I will say on every divrei sofrim, every d'Rabbanan, 1,005 different reasons. So Shlomo HaMelech was able to expand the idea of the Gemara being that every single thing that we have, every pasuk, every even halacha d'Rabbanan, has so many levels of comprehension, so many levels of understanding. Darash Rava, my dichsiv. What's the meaning of the pasuk? V'yoser shahaya kohelas chacham od limed das es ha'am v'izein lecheker. So we'll say, what's the meaning of that phrase? Literally, and more than kohelas was a chacham, od limed das es ha'am. He taught das, or knowledge, to the people. V'izein v'chiker. What does this mean? So the Gemara says, Tikein, so izein v'chiker. Tikein mashalim harbe. Ultimately, again, the Gemara says that he was metaking many mashalim, many different parables. Limed das es ha'am. What does it mean? That he taught knowledge to the nation. The agmare b'simanim tamim. Va'azbira b'may didam. This is actually very interesting. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Agmare b'simanim tamim. Kavala masoras v'simanim bein b'tevos hamikra bein b'girsa shal mishnah. The Shlomo HaMelech was able to make up different forms of different parts of the Masorah, and ultimately simanim, different signs between the letters, as well as different ways to remember various teachings. Furthermore, va'azbra b'may didamila, he was able to explain things with things that resembled. I will say, what does this mean? So sometimes the easiest way to go ahead and explain something is with an example, or with a mashal, or with a parable. So Shlomo HaMelech was instrumental in developing many of these mashalim, parables, examples, in order to be able to make Torah more understandable. V'izin v'chiker, tikein mashalim harbe. Amra Ula, Amra Belazar, betchila haysa Torah doma l'kfifa she'in la aznayim. In the beginning, Torah was like a basket with no handles. Ad sheba Shlomo va'asala aznayim, until Shlomo came along and he made handles for the basket. Now this in of itself is an interesting mashal. Look at Rashi. Va'asala aznayim shetikin eruvin v'yadayim v'gazer al hashnios la'arayos. Remember, as we saw in yesterday's daf, Shlomo Melech made a variety of different takanas. So he instituted eruv chatzeros. He instituted the need to wash one's hands before partaking of kodshim. Shnias la'arayos. He added on different levels to the prohibitions of arayos. Kinefarish b'yivamis va'ayidei kach ochzin Yisrael b'mitzvahs shenisracha kumin ha'avera k'derech shenoach lechos b'kli sheyesh lo beis yad masino. So this is actually very interesting, because the Pashup Pshat I would have thought with this Gemara was as follows. When it says that Shlomo Melech made handles to the basket, the way I would have understood that statement is how that ultimately before Shlomo, if you have a pot, and the pot doesn't have handles, it's just hard to grab onto it. So it sounds like Shlomo kind of took the pot and made the pot easier to grasp. So that's certainly a possibility, but Rashi understands a little bit differently. Rashi says if the pot is very hot, if you try to hold it, ultimately you'll get burned. But if you have handles on the pot, the handles allow you to better hold onto it. So Shlomo HaMelech made sure that we wouldn't get burned by the pot. And he made sure that ultimately, again, in other words, that we wouldn't come to transgress by adding on certain protective layers in the form of different gezerus. So very beautiful. So either again, it's that he allowed us to pick up the pot by understanding it better, the handles allow you to pick it up, or the handles prevent you from getting burned. Incredible, you saw. The Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, kitzososav taltalim. Literally, again, his curls are arranged. Amar Rav Chisda Amar Marokva Melame Sheish Lidrosh Al Kol Kotes V'Kotes Tili Tilim Shal Halachas. Bosai teaches us that every kotes, the kotes is like the little protrusion of the letter. Each and every protrusion of the letter has the ability to go ahead and teach us piles and piles of halachas. That Bosai, the power of the Torah is that not only are there lessons in the spoken or written word, but even in the way that the letters are written, right? Even in the coats, even in the little protrusions. Tile tilim halacha. Shchoros korev. What says a very profound Gemara. What does it mean when it says that ultimately, again, black like the raven? B'mi'at hamotzon. Both say, with whom can you find these tile halachas? Who is it who has the ability to amass an incredible amount of Torah knowledge? B'mi tap of chav beis. From those who get up early and those who stay late in the Beis Medrash. So I will say the idea being shchoros ke'orev. If you look at Rashi, Rashi says shchoros lashon shachris ke'orev lashon arvis. It's actually quite a beautiful drasha. Shchoros ke'orev means it's a little bit of a play on words. Shachar and arvis. How do you acquire greatness in learning? Ultimately getting up early to come to the Beis Medrash and staying late in the Beis Medrash. I will say, an incredible yesod that greatness in Torah is not just simply a function of learning, but greatness in Torah is a function of pushing oneself, and pushing oneself in ways that are often inconvenient. That's where Torah comes from. Greatness in Torah comes from mesiras nefesh, a willingness to put yourself in a little bit of discomfort in order to be able to go. So this is an incredible yesod. This is why this I think is often what we miss a little bit, which is we think that greatness in spirituality just comes from learning. Just learning. Well, it doesn't matter when you learn. As long as you learn, as long as you're kovea itim. You set aside. Now, by the way, that's not incorrect. Setting aside time to learn is absolutely, but there's an element of pushing yourself in ways that are a little bit uncomfortable, right? That's it. It's no different than the development of any muscle, right? If you want to develop muscle, so a person has to push themselves to the point that the muscle is strained. It's a little bit uncomfortable. If it's always comfortable, then by definition, there's no growth. So how does growth in Torah come? You don't live in your comfort zone. You push yourself out of your comfort zone a little bit to do more, to be more. Incredible. Rabbi Aram Misha Mashchi Panav Aleim Korev. Rabbi says, who acquires greatness in Torah? Literally one whose face blackens like a raven. So we'll say that lashon of face blackening means that a person pushes themselves to a point of exhaustion, to a point of a little bit of deprivation. Same idea of pushing to discomfort. But this is actually an incredible Gemara. Rava Amar, b'mishamashkim atzmo, b'mishamesim atzmo achzari, albanav v'albnei beiso ka'orev. Where does greatness of Torah come from? Ultimately, again, from one who makes himself, and Abba said, we'll translate this literally, then we'll explain. One who makes himself, achzari means like indifferent, or even a little, sometimes he translated as cruel, on his regarding his children and the members of his household, just like a raven. So apparently, if you look, Rashi says over here, Orev achzari albanav kidichsiv, livnei orev asher yikro, v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu mezamen and yitushin, v'nichnasen l'soch pien. So we'll say, so apparently the raven is not very kind and charitable to his offspring. So who ultimately, again, achieves greatness in Torah? To one who is a little bit indifferent, ultimately to his offspring like a raven. Now, what does that mean? Before we explain, the Gemara tells a little bit of a wild story. Ki had Rav Ada bar Masna hava ka'azul beirav. One time, Rav Ada bar Masna was going ultimately again to yeshiva. Amrala devisu, his wife called out to him, Yenuki didach my avitlu. What should I give your children to eat? Amrala, he said to her, Mishalima korme ba'agma. Are they out of reeds in the swamp, in the marsh? In other words, he told his wife, there's wild growing vegetables. Well, look at Rashi. The Rashi says, Kormi yirakos lishna achrina gemi lach ki akris lu rechicha de isbe v'tachni va'avdi rifta. So Rashi understands there's actually a type of plant that could be ground up into flour and made into bread. So he was telling his wife, there's still wild growing stuff that is available. So we'll say, so what's the pshat here? This doesn't exactly sound like the most normal of stories. So we'll say, so the idea being that it's all the same yesod, which is that greatness in Torah requires a certain level of mesiras nefesh. So what does it mean a person becomes indifferent? We'll say, this is obviously an extreme example of that. Not that Chazal are telling you to model this particular type of story, but the idea being that greatness in Torah requires sacrifices. So we'll say, so to put it very bluntly, meaning sometimes a person has to give up some family time as well. Sometimes a person, again, everybody would love to spend all the time in their world with their wife and with their kids and be there for the mishpacha. That's incredible, that's important. Sometimes you have to give up some of that in order to be able to grow in Torah. We'll say, lest you think, I just tell them, we'll say, people give up family time all the time to go to work and to do other things that have to get done. I'd love to spend the whole day with my family, right? Or at least that's what we're supposed to say, right? I'd love to spend the whole day. I'd love to spend the whole day with my family, but lamaisa, like there are things in life that have to get done. So the Gemara is saying, make your ruchnius a priority. At the end of the day, sometimes the family has to be put on the side in order for me to be able to accomplish my spiritual objectives. We'll say, just as an aside, there's another piece over here, which is this notion that sometimes greatness in Torah also comes through the giving up of certain material pursuits. You know, I saw just yesterday, that the Spinker Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, comments on this Gemara. He says something amazing. He says, this Gemara, is actually pretty well, it says this Gemara is the source for the custom of putting out grass on the floor during Shavuos. See, I will say this, we're used to, there's the minhag that we're aware of putting out flowers on Shavuos. The Tamei Minhag also brings on the minhag of putting grass down on the floor on Shavuos. Spinker Rebbe says this Gemara is a source of that. That also here, Rav Ada Ramasa is telling his wife, listen, there's grass, right? There's stuff growing that we can live on, we'll be fine. The notion that on Shavuos, Kabbalah Satorah, sometimes a person has to be ready to even sacrifice certain Gashmias things in order to be able to have incredible success in their Ruchnias. Incredible idea. So the Gemara says, so the idea being about say, not that one should tell his wife, go find stuff in the marsh to go ahead and give the kids, but the yesod being that sometimes one has to go ahead and put the family on the side, not on the side, not that they're not important, chas v'shalom, not that they're out of my heart, but I will say sometimes things have to get done in life. So l'maisa, my ruchnius has to be something that is just as important as going to work. So the Gemara goes right to Mishalim, son of Alpanav Lavidam, Rabbi Shimon Levi, Ilmali Mikra Kaso V'Yef Shala Omer. So let's listen to this. So literally it says, and he repays his enemies Alpanav Laha'avido. So you'll see how the Gemara explains the pasuk. Rabbi Shimon Levi says, if the pasuk wouldn't have written it, it would have been impossible to say it. Kiviyachol, ki adam shenose masu Alpanav U'Mavakish Lashlicho Imenu, like a person carrying a burden who just wants to get rid of it. So both say, the way the Gemara is understanding this pasuk is as follows: HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives reward to everyone, even to the wicked, even to the wicked. But when HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives reward to the wicked, he just wants to pay it out already and be done with it. That's lashon u'mishalim lisonav alpanav laha'avido. Literally, he goes there and he pays goodness to the wicked. Alpanav, it's like he's holding it like a person holding a burden who just can't wait to get rid of it. Lo ya'acher lisono amrab ila lisonav hu de lo ya'acher. It is to those who he despises that he does not delay reward. So this is incredible. The Ribbon Shalom dispenses reward to the wicked immediately, but to the righteous, very often, reward is delayed until Olam Haba. They will say such a profound Gemara. We'll say very profound Gemara. What does the pasuk mean when it says, these are the mitzvahs that I command you today to perform them? Hayom la'asosam. It means I command you today to do them, but not tomorrow to do them. In other words, Ribbon Shalom says, don't live life with the mantra that whatever could be done today could be done tomorrow also. But if you could do it today, then get it done today. I both say, I think we'd all agree that this is probably the formula for successful living. Do not kick the proverbial can down the road. Whatever can be done today, get it done. However, hayom la'asosam l'machar l'kabel schara. But just understand that even though you do the mitzvahs today, schar will often not come today. Schar often comes sometime later on, sometime in the future. Could be in olam hazeh, but could also be in olam haba. We'll say, and again, this is all about creating proper expectations. So on one hand, there's an urgency in performance, recognizing that at the end of the day, I may not see, the reward will come. The reward always comes, but I may not see that reward until later on in life, and maybe not even in this life, maybe in the next. So this is actually very interesting. So interestingly enough, it says erech hapayim, but it should say erech af. Now we'll say, now what is erech hapayim? The way we translate it is slow to anger. Slow to anger. One of the attributes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But interestingly enough, apayim is plural. So it should naturally be erech af, slow to anger. Why apayim? This is actually incredible. The Gemara says, Ella, erech apayim l'tzadikim, erech apayim l'rashaim. So we'll say, so interestingly enough, the way the Gemara is darshaning this phrase, or this pasuk, is that apayim doesn't mean anger, but rather apayim means face, panim. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Mashma, panim, bein shochakos, bein zomos. We'll say erech apayim means HaKadosh Baruch Hu is slow to show his face to the wicked, his face to the righteous. What does this mean? Panim, so the Gemara says, bein zomos, so apayim shochakos, marich uma'achel tzadikim la'asad lavo. V'apayim zomos marich l'rishon achar parnas l'lavas. So what it means is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is slow to show his face. He is slow to show his face to the wicked, and that he often doesn't punish them in this world, but punishes them in the world to come. And he's slow to show his face to the righteous, which is in the form of reward. That sometimes the reward doesn't come until much later. So I'll say the idea being that sometimes, what we yearn for more than anything is this instantaneous gratification, the ability to see the Yad Hashem here and now. And Chazal sensitizing us to this idea that although there is an urgency in performance, Kadosh Baruch Hu wants us to do now, the Rebbe Shalom runs the world, and that world, that universe pre-existed us and will exist after us. And sometimes Kadosh Baruch Hu does what he has to do, not on our timeline, never on our timeline, but ultimately on his. So a person has to be patient and recognize that ultimately the Rebbe Shalom always comes through just person has to be patient. And sometimes that patience even has to transcend this life and go into the next. We'll say back to Eruvin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Abeis Hasayim. Supposed to remember again, the Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda said, back to the Pasei Biros. So Rabbi Yehuda said that at most you can enclose an area of 2 base sa'ah. This was Rabbi Yehuda's idea, that Pasei Biros only works in an area of up to 2 base sa'ah. Sibailahu, bar upasin ka'amar, ol dilma bar velo pasin ka'amar. So here's the interesting shaila. When we say 2 base sa'ah, is that just the size of the well? Is that just the well? Or is that talking about the area including the Pasei Biros, including the partitions? So the Gemara says, I'm sorry, by the bar upasin ka'amar, ol dilma bar velo pasin ka'amar, adam no sing inav beboro. So we'll say, do we say that in general, a person is simply focused on the area of the well? And therefore, we're not concerned that a person will come to go ahead and end up carrying in an area that is larger than 2 sa'ah and a karfif. Now, we'll say, one piece of information that we're going to expound on is, in general, everyone agrees that an area that is not used for residential purposes, you can't, let me say differently, you can't enclose a non-residential area of larger than 2 base sa'ah on Shabbos. Now let's assume for a moment that everyone's agreeing with that concept. So the question is over here in this case of the well. So do we say, according to Rabbi Yehuda, do we say that a person is focused on the well, not really focused on the area surrounding it, and therefore even if the area surrounding it, including the Pasei Biros, larger than 2 base sa'ah, a person is not going to come to enclose a karfef larger than 2 base sa'ah. O Dilma, Adam nosin inaba mechitza. So maybe no, a person is not focused simply on the well, but a person's focused on the entire enclosure. And we're concerned that if the area is larger than 2 base sa'ah, you may come to include other non-residential areas. You may come to enclose, other non-residential areas if they are larger than 2 base sa'ah. So which one is it? So we'll say a simple shaila. Does Rabbi Yehuda's 2 base sa'ah include just the well, or is it including the enclosures in the surrounding area as well? So Tashma, Kamehin Mikuravin, what's the smallest amount you could enclose in the area by the well? Kadeirosha Veruba Shalpara. The size ultimately again to include the head and the majority of the body of the animal. V'kamehin Miruchakin, and how far ultimately again can the mechitzas go? In other words, how far can they extend out? Afilu kur v'afilu kurayim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Beis sasayim mutter. Yes, I mean beis sasayim asa. So we'll say the Rabbanan say that there is no limit to the size of the enclosure you can make with the Pasei Biros. Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion that the maximum is 2 beis sa'ah. Yosem beis sasayim asa. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Iatamode bedir v'sahar mukt usahar muktzo v'chatzar afilu beis chamishas kurim beis asara kurim shemuter. So the Rabbanan said, this is just a conversation from the Mishnah. So the Rabbanan said to Rabbi Yehuda, don't you agree that in other areas, like the deer, both remember again, deer and sahar are 2 different types of pens for animals. Muktza was an area where you keep firewood. Chatzar is a chatzar that you could even enclose much larger areas. Rabbi Yehuda says, yes, but Amr Lahem zu mechitza ve'elu pasin. Rabbi Yehuda said, here's the distinction. Those enclosed areas have bona fide mechitzas. When you have bona fide mechitzas, you can enclose as much as you want. These pasin, remember, these L-shaped boards, the diyumadin, are inferior mechitzas. And because they're inferior mechitzas, therefore they can only enclose a smaller area. Rabbi Shimon Elazar Omer, beis sasayim mutter. So Rabbi Shimon Elazar says that if you have a bar, if the actual pit, the actual well itself, that is beis sasayim is mutter to enclose. And ultimately, again, they said that you have to just enclose a minimum area of rosh and ruba shalpar. Now says the Gemara, Hamid Dikamar, Rabbi Shimon Elazar bar v'lo pasin. The fact that Rabbi Shimon Elazar said that it's dafka the bar, not including the boards, not including the diyumadin, mechlal Rabbi Yehuda bar upasin kamar. It sounds like according to Rabbi Yehuda, the 2 base sa'ah needs to include the entire area, the bar as well as the mechitzas. To which the Gemara says, no, velohi, Rabbi Yehuda bar below pasin kamar. Not true. When Rabbi Yehuda says that there's a maximum area of 2 base sa'ah, that's actually just referring to the actual well itself, to the pit, but not to the enclosure. The Gemara says, Reb Shimon ben Elazar. If that's the case, then is he not saying the same thing as Reb Shimon Elazar? Ikabenahu arich v'katin. Rabbi say, interestingly enough, the nafkamina between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is a rectangular bar. What's the din of a rectangular bar? If you look at Rashi, arich v'katin, kuf al nun, a bar that is 100 by 50, dahavu sasayim kechatra mishkan, Rabbi Yehuda afapishe meruba motor. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, even a rectangular bar is going to be okay. It could be enclosed. According to Rabbi Shimon, halacha l'maaseh only works with a squared off bar, not with a rectangular bar. So again, it appears that Rabbi Yehuda is holding that halacha l'maaseh when he gives his maximum of 2 base saw, that includes the bar as well as the enclosure. I will say, now for our purposes, it doesn't really matter all that much because we don't paskin it matters of course. But halacha l'maaseh, the Rambam adapts the view of the Rabbanan, not the view of Rabbi Yehuda. Klal Amar Rabbi Shimon Elazar, Kol Avir Shetashmisha L'Dira. We'll say now the Gemara just ends off with another important principle. Now that we quote Rabbi Shimon Elazar, the Gemara quotes another principle. Kol Avir Shetashmisha L'Dira. So we'll say this wording is actually very interesting. Any area that is used for residential purposes, which also means any area which is enclosed because you want to use the enclosed area for some type of activity of daily living. Kigon, dir, v'sahar, muktzah, chatzar. So we'll say, so these are all areas which are enclosed. The enclosure itself is used for some type of activity of daily living. Then what's the halacha? Afilu beis chameshes kurim ubas asaras kurim mutter. So we'll say this is the general klal. Any area that is enclosed for an activity of daily living, there is no ceiling as to the amount of area you are permitted to enclose. Conversely, the chaldira shetashmisha la'avir. But I will say what this means is as follows: any area which is enclosed, but the point of the enclosure is not for the space that's enclosed, but rather the point of the enclosure is to allow you to use space outside of the enclosure. Now, what does that mean? Here's a good example. Kigon, Borginen Shebesados. So we'll say the example is the Borginen. When we had Borginen yesterday's daf, Borginen are the huts. So remember again, why would you? So we discussed the huts yesterday, Lagabe extending the tchum, right? That if you have a hut that's within 70 2/3 amas of the edge of the city, that you could measure the tchum from that hut. Let's leave that aside. What were those Borginen for? Those Borginen were like watchman huts. Like if you were watching over a field, you would reside in that Borginen. Now, I will say, here's what's interesting. That Borginen, that hut, the primary purpose of the enclosure was not really for the interior of the enclosure, right? What's the primary purpose of the enclosure? To allow you to watch the field on the outside. So that's an example of something that is enclosed, not for the enclosed area. In other words, your intention, your focus is not on the area enclosed. Your intention actually is for the area outside of the enclosure. See here the distinction, as opposed to, let's say, a pen of an animal, which is enclosed, or a muktzah, which is used to keep wood, where ultimately, again, the point of the enclosure is the actual enclosed area. The Borginen was enclosed that you could sit in there, but to watch over the outside area. So any area like that, that's called dira shetashmisha la'avir. You have an enclosure, but the purpose of the enclosure is to allow you to properly utilize the area outside of the enclosure. You could go in Borginen shebesados. The halacha is beis sasayim mutter, yaser mi beis sasayim asas. We'll say, interestingly enough, if you have an area which is enclosed not for the purpose of the enclosure, but ultimately for the area outside of the enclosure, you are capped at an area of 2 sa. Incredible. So we'll say the Gemara Mishnah goes weiter. Very interesting Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda says, Im hayederch mifas kasan yisakena litzdadin. So we'll say, listen to this. Still in Paseviros. Imagine the following scene. So I have my well. Now, as we established, the din is, right, I have a well in Eretz Yisrael, right, and I want to use it for my livestock, so I go ahead and I close off the well with 4 L-shaped posts. Perfect, Shalom Al Yisrael. Only one problem. Remember again, I will say, these wells, the wells that we were talking about in question, where are they situated? through Rosh Hashanah, right? That's the whole chapel. Remember again, the whole issue, the whole reason I have to get into these mechitzas is because the well itself is Rosh Hashanah, but it's situated in Rosh Hashanah, and I want to be able to draw water. So now I have another problem. My other problem is, what happens if the rabbim, the public, the way they utilize Rosh Hashanah is they walk through the mechitzas. So can you imagine? I have my well, 4 L-shaped posts all around it, but the public thoroughfare goes through those posts. So we'll say, so the shaila is, does the pedestrian traffic of the public thoroughfare nullify the mechitzas or not? So we'll say, so Rabbi Yehuda says, you have to redirect traffic. You have to redirect traffic. You have to go ahead and move the rabbim or move the mechitzas, right, to the side. The idea being, we'll say, that pedestrian traffic which goes through those mechitzas nullifies the mechitzas, which makes sense. The point of the L-shaped mechitzas is what Rabbi said, to create a Rosh Hashanah. If the rabbim walks through it, it's a Rosh Hashanah. The Chum say no, ain't no tzarech. You don't have to reroute the Rosh Hashanah. So let's analyze. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, Darin Tarbayu, Kan hodiacha kochan shal mechitzas. So Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar both said, here you see the power of mechitzas. See, Rabbi say the fact that the Chachamim do not require you to go ahead and redirect the rabbim shows you the power of mechitzas. Right? That mechitzas are so powerful, Rabbi say, that's what? That even the rabbim going through it does not nullify them. So the Gemara says, Kanus, really, does this mean that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar hold like the Rabbanon, that pedestrian traffic does not nullify the mechitzas? V'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, Yerushalayim. Ilmolei dal tosan in alos balayla chayavan ala mishum Rosh Hashanah. We'll say Yerushalayim, were it not for the fact that the walls are closed at night, were it not for the fact that the walls are closed at night, you'll be chayiv on it mishum Rosh Hashanah. So they both say, so now again, why is that important? Because both say Yerushalayim has mechitzas. It has walls. But you see that the walls by themselves are not enough to call it a Rosh Hashanah, were it not for the fact that the doors are closed at night. We're going to discuss more about doors in just a bit. So the Gemara says, so you see from here that mechitzas by themselves are not enough to make an area into Rosh Hashanah, if indeed the rabbim walks through it. Ela kan v'lo svirle. Rather, you have to say that Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar are testifying to the strength of the position of the Chachamim, that mechitzas are so strong according to the Chachamim that what? That even if you have the rabbim walk through it, it doesn't negate the Rosh Hashanah, the dimension of it, but Lamaisa they don't hold of it. So again, remember, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says pedestrian traffic nullifies mechitzas. The Chachamim say it does not. The Gemara is now going to point out that we have a contradiction in positions. This Sanya we learned, yes, Alkin Am Rabbi Yehuda, Mishahaya lo shnei batim, Mishnei Tzidrosh Surab. I'm supposed to listen to this. Rabbi Yehuda said as follows. We've seen this case a number of times. If someone has 2 homes on opposite sides of the Rosh Hashanah, I'm supposed to say, so just imagine for a moment you have a street Rosh Hashanah, and then on either side of the width of the Rosh Hashanah, someone has 2 homes. Osin lo lechem mikan v'lechem mikan, koram mikan v'koram mikan, v'nosei v'nosein be'emtza. Person can make a lechi on one side or a korah on one side, and he could carry across the Rosh Hashanah from one of his homes to the other. Amrulo, so the Rabbanan said to Rabbi Yehuda, Ein ma'arvin Rosh Hashanah b'kach. So the Rabbanan said, no, you cannot make a Rosh Hashanah out of a Rosh Hashanah. So Rabbanan say, Kashid Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yehuda, Kashid Rabbanan. The Rabbanan is supposed to say contradiction. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda says that what? That pedestrian traffic nullifies Rosh Hashanah. And yet in the Brisa he says that it doesn't. And in our Mishnah, the Rabbanan held that pedestrian traffic does not nullify a Rosh Hashanah, and yet in this Brisa they do, to which the Gemara says, no. So Rabbi Yehuda lo kash, it's not a contradiction. Why not? So the Gemara says, Chasam de'ika shtei mechitzas mal yasa, hachalek shtei mechitzas mal yasa. Also in the case of the Brisa, you have 2 good mechitzas. So what are the 2 good mechitzas? Each side of the home is a mechitza. So when you have 2 good mechitzas, and then add in there a lechi or a korah, once you have 2 bona fide mechitzas, Rabbi Yehuda holds that even if the rabbim walks through it, you could make a bona fide Rosh Hashanah. However, again, in our case, Rabbi Osai, you remember what's the case of the Mishnah? Diyumadin. you do not have any bona fide mechitzas. D'Rabbanan nami lo kasha, hacha ika shem arba mechitzas, hacha leka shem dal mechitzas. They're both saying just enough. The Rabbanan aren't contradicting themselves either. Why? In the Mishnah, at least you have 4 mechitzas. Granted, they're inferior mechitzas, but you have 4 mechitzas. Once you have 4 mechitzas, that's called the Rosh Hashanah, even if the rabbin walks through it. In the case of the Reish Shabbos, where it's just the 2 homes, you do not have 4 mechitzas. All right. Amar Mitzvah Bar Yosef, Amar Yochanan, Eretz Yisrael, Ein Chayav and Alam Mishum Rosh Hashanah. A fascinating statement. Eretz Yisrael is not subject to the halachas of a Rosh Hashanah. Okay. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? Yosef Rav Dimi the Kamar La Lahashmaisa. What does this mean? What it sounds like it's saying is there's no Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael. How could that be? My time, Amud Beis. Ilema mishum demakef le sulma detzor mehach gisa umachtana degader mehach gisa. If you want to say Abosai, because on one side of Eretz Yisrael, there's what the Gemara calls the sulma detzor, which is literally the ladders of Tzor, which means one side it's mountains. So one side it's mountains, so the height creates a natural partition, a mechitza, and on the other side of Eretz Yisrael, there are deep slopes, both which create partition. So you're seeing that maybe Eretz Yisrael as a land is considered to be enclosed on one side by high mountains, on other sides by a steep slope, and therefore because it's considered to be enclosed, therefore alocha l'maisa, it's not a Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara says, Bavel nami makif le pras mehach gisa, the diglas mehach gisa. Bavel then is also enclosed, right? It has Nar Pras, it has the Euphrates on one side and the Tigris on the other side. The kuli alma nami makif okainis. The entire world is also enclosed by the okainis is like the Atlantic, the ocean. I was about to say, if you're going to tell me that literally countries or land, maybe even continents, are all enclosed by natural partitions. Also remember again, a mechitza could be something that goes very high up. A mechitza could also be something that goes down on a somewhat steeper slope. So you could find very large masses that are quote unquote enclosed. But it doesn't sound, we've never really seen that that's the way that enclosures work. Dilma malos umardos ka'amrit. So maybe ultimately, again, look at Rashi. Malos umardos sheba ka'amrit she'in chayav and alam mishum shesrabim delonicha drisa didov l'havish som. So maybe you're not saying the land as a whole. Maybe at the end of the day, you're talking about that in Eretz Yisrael, the very steep parts and the very tall parts. The very malos means, well, Shuzbo said they both mean steep, but the very steep parts going upwards and the very steep parts going downwards are not considered to be Rosh Hashanah in Eretz Yisrael. So what does this mean? What the sounds like it's saying is that if you have parts in Eretz Yisrael, which people say, let me take a step back. When we speak about Rosh Hashanah, so you say to yourself, what does Rosh Hashanah mean? Any area that's publicly owned, right? Or better stated, any area that's not privately owned, by definition, is Rosh Hashanah. What the Gemara is suggesting over here is that maybe in Eretz Yisrael it's a little bit different. Maybe in Eretz Yisrael, any area, even if it's not, even if it is publicly owned, if it's not easily usable by the rabbin, it doesn't have the halachic status of a Rosh Hashanah. What's an example of an area that is publicly owned but not really easily usable by the rabbin? An area that is very steep, either going up or going down, right? The areas like mountains or slopes. Amarle karkafna. You literally both say karkafna means literally rather actually bar hal gugolas. It literally means a person with a head, which means an adam chashav. He's giving him a shkaya karkafna. Chazisi the reishach be'amudi. I saw your head between the pillars. When Rabbi Yochanan explained this teaching just like that in Eretz Yisrael, areas of very steep slopes, even though they are quote unquote publicly owned, do not have the status of a Rosh Hashanah. Itmar nami Kiyasa Rabin Am Rabbi Yochanan Am Rabbi Ava Am Rabbi Yochanan is really incredible. Malos umardo sheberetz Yisrael ein chayovin alen mishum Rosh Hashanah. Ultimately, areas in Eretz Yisrael that are very steep in their ascent or very steep in their descent do not have the halachic status of a Rosh Hashanah. Why? Lefi she'inon kidigle hamidbar, because they do not resemble the desert encampment. Rabbi say, remember again, everything in Shabbos comes from Klal Yisrael's encampment in the desert by the Mishkan. So what does this mean? That the steep areas, the steep ascent or steep descent areas, are not like Kedigle Midbar, look at Rashi, Shengedigle Midbar, the Eretz Chaloka Haisa, Sha'anan Mashva. So both say this is incredible. In the desert, the area was flat. Why was the area flat? Because one of the miracles in the desert was the cloud would travel in front of Am Yisrael and would flatten out everything in front of them. So both say, therefore, again, where do we get the dimensions of Rosh Hashanah? If I remember again, where do we get the dimensions of Rosh Hashanah? From the desert, from the way that the Levitic wagons traveled, right? They traveled two side by side, right? So that gives me the dimensions of 16 amas across, 600,000 people traversing the area of the 600,000 men, traversing the area of the desert. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, the desert was a flat Rosh Hashanah. So what do we learn from here? That any area that is too steep to be traversed in a normative way, even though it is owned by the public, does not have the status of Rosh Hashanah, at least in Eretz Yisrael. Very, very interesting. Rachba me Rava. So we'll say Rachba asked the following question of Rava. What about the following case? Tell hamislaket asara mitoch arba v'rabim bokim bo chayav l'm shmush zamo idu chayav alav. But what about the following? What if you have a mound that goes up, that has a slope? It goes up to a height of 10 tfachim within a slope of 4 amas. What's the halacha in such a situation like that? And I will say, and people use it. What's the halacha? Chayav and alav mishum sh'tzarabno in chayav and alav. Does this have the status of Rosh Hashanah or not? Sabaliba d'Rabbanan lo tibai lecha. According to the Rabbanon, it's not a shayla. Why not? Hashto uma haslam denecha tashmishay. So here's what's amazing. In our case in the Mishnah, remember again where you have the 4 diyumadin, right? The 4 L-shaped posts which demarcate an area, and the rabbim walk through it. And it's a very easily usable area. Yet what? The Rabbanon say pedestrian traffic does not negate the mechitzas. They'll say if you have a mound of dirt which has a height of 10 tfachim over a slope of 4 amas, that has the dimensions of a rishus hayachid. So according to the Rabbanon, even though the Rabbim use it, they would not negate the identity of that mound as a rishus hayachid. So the Gemara says, "Hacha delo necha tashmish lekol shekain." So again, if the Rabbanon don't allow pedestrian traffic to negate a rishus hayachid, even when the use of that area is easy, all the more so they will not go ahead and allow pedestrian traffic to negate the dimensions of a Rosh Hashanah when use is not as easy, such in this case where there's a slope. So where does the cash come? According to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that pedestrian traffic through the mechitzas in the Mishnah does negate the dimension, does negate the Rosh Hashanah. So the Gemara says, so as I do, we say it's in the Mishnah where the rabbim walk through the mechitzas, and it's relatively easy public use. That's when pedestrian traffic negates mechitzas. But in this case over here, we're talking about a mound. And because it's a mound, the public use of the area is quote-unquote not as easy. Maybe pedestrian traffic will not negate the area as Rosh Hashanah. Or perhaps, again, there's no distinction. Amrullah said to him, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Chayavin. In fact, halacha l'maisa, it'll be a rishus harabim. It'll be a rishus harabim that according to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi say, and essentially what we're saying over here, vafilu olan lo bechevel. I'm sorry, Chayavin. So we'll say, so what seems to come out over here is according to Rabbi Yehuda, any time the rabbim walk through an area of Rosh Hashanah, that they commonly walk through an area, even if halacha l'maisa, the use of the area is not quote-unquote easy, pedestrian traffic through a rishus hayachid negates the identity of the area as a rishus hayachid. They'll say, what happens if in order to get up the mound, they have to use a rope? Amrle in. He said, yes, even if they have to use a rope, if there is pedestrian traffic that goes through it, halacha l'maisa, it negates the identity as a rishus hayachid. Rabbi, listen to this. Va'afilu b'ma'alos beis maron. Rabbi say, what about like the steps of beis maron? Rabbi say, now what is that? This is incredible. Say, it sounds familiar. The Gemara Masechtas Rosh Hashanah. Listen to how timely this is. The Gemara Masechtas Rosh Hashanah says, "Rosh Hashanah kol ba'ei olam ovrim lefanav kibnei maron." On Rosh Hashanah, all the inhabitants will come before HaKadosh Baruch Hu like bnei maron. The Gemara gives three interpretations as to what bnei maron either kibnei emarna, like sheep, gechayalos beis David, or kemalos beis maron. Beis maron was a steep ascent that had stairs, but you could only walk through it one at a time. So the Gemara is asking over here, so what happens if the mound is so steep like malos beis maron? Amar le'in. He said, yeah, even if it's that steep, still halacha l'maisa, again it's Rosh Hashanah. So we'll say what comes out over here is the following, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, any time the Rabbim walk through a Rishus HaYachid, that's pedestrian Rishus HaYachid, it negates the identity of as a Rishus HaYachid and becomes a Rishus HaRabbim. And the Chiddush that the Gemara is suggesting over here is, even if the use is complicated, in other words, even if the use is not easy. So we'll say, in the case of the Mishnah, the Rabbim is passing through Rishus HaYachid, and it's what we call Neicha Tashmishte. It's easily usable. The Chiddush is, even if the area is not easily usable, but they traverse it, halacha l'maisa, they will convert the Rishus HaYachid into a Rishus HaRabbim. Eis ve, what is the kasha? Chatzar shrab nichnasin bezu v'yotzin bezu Rishus HaRabbim l'tuma or Rishus HaYachid l'Shabbos. Let's say if you have a chatzar that the Rabbim go in one side and come out the other side, the halacha is it is considered to be a Rishus HaRabbim l'tuma purposes. Rabbi say, remembering it wasn't made for tuma purposes. You know that the halacha by tuma is safek tuma b'Rishus HaRabbim. We are mekel. B'Rishus HaYachid, we are machmir. So the Gemara says, if you have a chatzar that the Rabbim goes through it, for Tumah purposes it's a Rishus HaRabbim, but it's considered to be a Rishus HaYachid for Shabbos. So the Gemara says, money, whose opinion does this reflect? Ilei Rabbanon, if you want to say it's the Rabbanon, Hashto Mahasam Denecha Tash Mishtei, Amir Rabbanon lo Asra Mevat Lemechitzta, Hachad lo Necha Tash Mishtei Koshkin. So most according to the Rabbanon, it's obvious. According to the Rabbanon, even an area where the Rabbim use easily, they will not convert into a Rishus HaRabbim. Certainly in this case of the Chatzar, I will say a Chatzar is not an area that's easily usable for the Rabbim. Why? Because I will say Chatzeros are small. So if the Rabbim are going to use it, that means they're being constricted in an area. So if according to the Rabbanon, ultimately, again, of course, they're going to go on and be Mevatel Mechitza. Allah Rabbi Hudahi. But rather, you have to say it's Rabbi Huda. You have to say it's Rabbi Huda. So the Gemara says, so you see from here that according to Rabbi Huda, halacha l'maisa, when it's a situation of lo necha tashmishtei, not easy to use it, the Rabbim will not come and be mevatel the mechitzas. To which the Gemara says, lo, the olam Rabbanon, really it reflects the view of the Rabbanon, u'rishus harabim l'tuma tzrichalei. And the truth is, the only reason we really needed to bring this down was to bring up the halachas of tumah. To bring up that according to the Rabbanon, although the Rabbanon will hold, will say that what? That halacha l'maisa, public usage of a Rishus HaYachid does not transform the area into a Rishus HaRabbim for Shabbos. It will transform it into a Rishus HaRabbim for what? For Tumah purposes. Tashma. So one more case. The Gemara says, Mevuos hamefuloshos beboros. So we'll say, now this case at first glance doesn't seem to, the way it's worded doesn't seem to, literally sounds like, Rabbi will say, a mavui hamafulosh means a mavui that's open on both sides. So it sounds like it's saying a mavui that opens up into a pit. B'shichin and b'oros, or wells, or cisterns. Rishus HaYachid l'Shabbos, Rishus HaRabbim l'Tumah. It is considered to be a private domain for Shabbos, but a public domain for Tumah purposes. Says the Gemara, b'boros sachadaitra. What does that mean? That the mavui ends up in a bar. Ela liboros rishus. Ela liboros. Rather, Rabbi say we're going to see over here. Actually, we'll stop with this case. But this is going to be a situation where halacha l'maisa, there is a pit at the end of the mavui with a small path around it. So we'll say we'll pick up with this case tomorrow. But again, I just want to end off with this machlokis. So we'll say the machlokis as brought down in the Mishnah is the machlokis that continues to follow us, which is what happens when the public walks through a Rishus HaYachid. What does that do to the Rishus HaYachid? The Chachamim saying absolutely nothing. Once an area is marked off by mechitzas, even mechitzas geruos, even inferior mechitzas, like the diyumadin, once rishas hayachid, always a rishas hayachid. Rabbi Huda is saying no. If the rabbim walk through it, they have the ability to fundamentally change the nature of the space. If the rabbim walk through it, even if the mechitzas are there, halacha l'maisa, and the area is transformed into a rishus harabim. Not only that, but according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if the area is not easily usable, like the mound, right? Even if it requires a rope to get up, at the end of the day, we look at traffic patterns. If the public uses it, even if it's not an easy use, even if there are mechitzas, it becomes a rishus harabim according to Rabbi Yehuda, but according to the Chachamim, the mechitzas preserve the identity of the makom, even if the rabbim go through it. Halacha l'maisa, how we paskin, and Meretz Hashem we'll see tomorrow. Shkach, we'll say.